Hi, welcome to our channel Chia Globe. Today we would like to talk about causes of climate change and how is it connected to economics and politics. So, let's dig in. Thank you very much for coming here today.
Thank you for having me.
So could you maybe do a little self-introduction?
I'm Julia Leventon. I'm head of the Department of Human Dimensions of Global Change at Czech Globe. The research that we do in the department really looks at the social impacts and drivers of global change, like climate change and biodiversity loss. And we're really looking at ways that we can stop these processes of global change and adapt to those that are already happening. My own research looks at processes of transformation, so how we can change the systems that are driving global change.
Okay, so you mentioned the climate change. Is it only an ecological issue?
Not at all. I actually see it as a social issue. Of course, we see the impacts in what's happening to the physical, the natural world. So we can see the impacts to biodiversity, to drought, for example, to rainfall patterns, and of course to temperatures, global temperatures. But actually, to me, what's interesting about that is that it is fundamentally a problem that has social impacts around, for example, availability of drinking water, availability of food, public health impacts to people. And it's also fundamentally a problem that is caused by society. Without people driving emissions of carbon dioxide, then we don't have climate change. And so really when we talk about climate change, I see that as being a social issue.
Okay, and maybe could you name some issues for the climate change or the main causes of it?
What we do know is that there are emissions that drive this process of global warming. The two biggest ones that we talk about are carbon dioxide and methane for driving this greenhouse effect. But when I talk about it being a social problem, that's because these emissions are only generated by processes that we do as a society. So for example, our global agricultural systems, our food systems that produce, process and deliver food to us are big emitters of carbon dioxide. And that's through the way that we use land, for example, through deforestation to create agricultural land, through the kinds of fertilizers that we use, through the crops that we produce. Then the movement of this food around the globe, its processing, its packaging and its delivery to door. That all creates emissions. And particularly if we're talking about meat, for example, and the methane emissions from producing beef and animals for our own consumption. And the land required to produce the food to feed those animals, that all produces emissions that drive this process of global warming. We also can talk about the travel behaviours that we have, for example, using our cars, flying around the world, that all produces emissions. And basically everything we do every day, everything that we consume has emissions attached to it.
Okay, so you're saying that it's mainly a social issue, but is it somehow related to economy and politics?
Absolutely. What we do know from research is that the economy is a huge problem that's driving our behaviours. We live in a capitalist economy that is pursuing economic growth. And the global economy basically wants to grow and grow and grow and grow every year. That's what we're all pursuing. But there's a limit to what it can grow into. We have known this since the 70s when the first sort of UN reports about limits to growth came out. There is a limit to the natural carrying capacity of the planet. And so when we're talking about economic growth, it's sort of pushing against those limits right now and really stepping beyond those limits. We know that there are certain planetary boundaries or limits that have already been exceeded. For example, the amount of chemicals that are out in the biosphere, our carbon dioxide emissions, they're all in excess of what the planet can cope with. And that's why we're seeing the impacts of global warming and biodiversity loss at the moment. Fundamentally, if we're thinking about what that means for us, it's basically in this global economic system is pushing our behaviours, it's pushing us to consume more, and it's trapping us in ways of behaving. So when we think about our own behaviours and what we consume, we're being pushed to consume more and more in order to grow the economy. We're being pushed to work more and more. And we're being told to buy this, buy that, go on holiday here, travel there. And we're all acting with economic common sense. We buy the things that make most economic sense to us, that are cheaper for us. But actually, all of these behaviours are not very good for the environment. If we're wanting to buy meat at the volumes that we're buying meat, but we don't want to pay much money for it, that's pushing the people who produce meat to then produce it in an industrial way, to put lots of animals together in one building, to not really care about their welfare and to not really have an eye on the environmental consequences of that, of what they do with the waste, and how they manage the emissions from that plant. And the same can be seen, for example, in the way that we buy new electronics. They are planned to expire after 2 or 3 years, and we get rid of them and we buy new. Every time we do that, there is a consequence on the environment because it requires more materials to be put into the economy. It requires mining, energy, and consumption. And all of that has an environmental impact. So when we talk about the lack of sustainability in the world, it quite often comes down to this economic system that's driving our patterns of consumption.
Yeah, I see. And what about politics? Is it somehow related to this as well?
Yeah, I think these days it's really quite hard to separate politics and economics, right? Because actually our decision makers, our politicians, are making decisions about how to steer that economy and how to steer us within it. So the two aren't really separable. The two things go hand in hand. But what we've got at the moment, the political decisions that we can make are really about how we steer that economy. What kind of regulations do we put in place? Do we make decisions that provide for society, or do we make decisions that provide for the companies and profit maximization? And there's a split there. If we are managing our economy to increase the incomes of our industries, then that's often at the expense of everyday people, all of us, really. A good example of this, I think, is that we can think about, for example, transport provision. Mm-hmm. One of the simplest things that we can all do to minimise emissions is to use public transport. And this is where economics and politics really intersect. Actually, across a lot of Europe, our public transport provisions have been outsourced to private companies. They've been sold off. Coming from Britain, this is a really good example of this, the privatisation of public transport in the UK, for example. So now the bus services are run by private companies. And it doesn't make economic sense for them to run frequent services to rural communities because there's not enough people using those services for them to make a profit. So they've then decided to cut those services. And so people in rural communities rely on having a car to get to places, to get to work, to do their shopping, to access services, healthcare, etc. So they now have to have a car. If we're now talking about managing the environment and cutting down people's personal car use, then the best thing that the politicians could do would be to say, okay, let's support public transport use. Let's subsidise that or make sure that there is infrastructure in place. But they no longer have that control because they've sold the transport companies off to private companies. And so they can't do that. They can't force these private sector actors to act in a way that's good for the environment. So they're having to make different decisions now. So in that way, this question of economics and politics, it's actually the same thing a lot of the time.
Yeah. When we're talking about effects of climate change, will it actually affect every country in the same way, or is it somewhat different?
It's very different. We're maybe starting to be conscious of the fact that climate change has an impact. We're seeing that, for example, in drought, in the fact that there's less snowfall in the winter, the winds that we've had this year, for example, as a result of more energy being in the atmosphere, driving strong winds and those kinds of storms. So we're starting to see those impacts. But this is really just the beginning for us. Whereas if you look at some other countries, they've been experiencing impacts for far longer. So 10, 15 years ago, we were looking at drought, extreme weather, flooding in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, and it was wiping out food crops for people in places like Malawi and Zimbabwe. And so they've been experiencing the impacts for far longer and been dealing with these climate change impacts for far longer. And what we do know, 2 weeks ago, the IPCC Working Group 2 report came out on impacts, adaptation, the societal impacts of climate change. And what we do know is that the impacts are really different depending on countries, and it tends to be those countries in what we would call the global south, the poorer countries, that are already experiencing far greater impacts of climate change. And because of their poverty levels, the lack of infrastructure that they already have there, they're also in a worse place to adapt and deal with that. They don't have the infrastructure or the capacity to adapt to those greater impacts as well. So it's definitely not a uniform impact across the globe. And actually climate change we often talk about as being a question of justice. There are people in the world who will not notice climate change for a long time to come. And there are people in the world who are already experiencing devastating impacts of climate change.
Recently, there have also been talks about climate-caused migration, that people from these poorer regions are trying to move somewhere else where they can have kind of better life, less affected by climate.
Honestly, we're going to see this more and more. I think that we've probably underestimated the role of climate in existing migration patterns that we've already seen. What we do know is that, for example, climate change is thought to have played a role in the crisis in Syria. And that, of course, we saw the impacts in migration of that and people coming to Europe. And Europe struggled with people coming here. The political response caused a struggle. We're going to see this more and more. People are going to move if they cannot produce food, if they cannot get water, and if the temperatures are unlivable, people are not going to stay where they are. People are going to move. One of the key questions that we have in Europe coming up, and this is a political and a social question, is how do we respond to that? Migration is going to happen, and we have a choice here in Europe. Do we close the doors and pretend that it's not our problem and keep people out? Or do we find a way of integrating people and responding better to the challenges of migration? When we look at a few years ago, the IPCC had a special report on the dangers of exceeding 1.5 degrees of warming. And one of the things that they highlighted was the impact to our societies and the chance of civil unrest if global temperatures continue to increase and far exceed 1.5 degrees. And there's all kinds of drivers for that civil unrest, for example, conflicts over food, water, resources. But one of those drivers is migration. And that's not to say that migration is a bad thing. I'm actually of the idea that we should be opening the doors and integrating people in. But we can cause conflict by the way that we react to migration. And if we react to migration by closing the doors and telling people to stay away, then we're going to have civil unrest, because we are going to be seeing millions of people leaving uninhabitable areas over the next few decades. If we close the doors and tell them they can't come here, that's going to cause problems. And instead, we as a society, one of the ways that we need to adapt is to think about how do we integrate people? How do we shift our societies and our mindsets to be able to cope with these mass movements of people?
What are some other effects that the climate change can have on Europe?
One of the biggest things that we're seeing at the moment is drought. The drought that's happening in highly productive agricultural landscapes is quite a concern. That gives me sleepless nights, if I'm honest. So it's going to get harder to produce food in Europe. There are parts of Europe that potentially in the short term will do better. Like, for example, southern Sweden will be able to produce more food in the short term because of a more moderate climate for them. But over the long term, and long term, I'm talking like 50 years, not like centuries. In the longer term, that's going to also have problems with producing food. The other problem that we've got is sea level rise. So coastal areas, as the ice caps melt, sea levels are going to go up, and we're going to be seeing much more flooding of coastal areas. So places like the Netherlands, they're all low-lying areas, but even, I mean, big parts of the UK are likely to be underwater. And all across, basically anywhere that's low-lying along the coast is going to have a problem. But that also, the changing rainfall patterns, when we talk about changing rainfall patterns, we often talk about, okay, there's going to be more rain, but it's, or sometimes there's going to be less rain and sometimes there's going to be more rain. And it's that change in pattern that's the problem, that sometimes we're going to have drought and other times we're going to have a short period of time where there is a huge amount of rain, and we just can't deal with that. Our rivers are going to overflow, streets are going to flood. We've just been seeing this in Australia over the last couple of weeks, right, where they have had catastrophic flooding because of a sudden inundation of a huge amount of rain in a short period of time. And that is going to be a problem for us here in Europe. And for me, the question is, how do we adapt to that? We have these cities, we have infrastructure in place, we have people who live their lives in a very sort of static way. We are attached to places and property and infrastructure. And how do we very rapidly now change that so that we can respond to flooding, to drought, to this incoming of people, these changes, and do so in a way that is good for us as a society, and hopefully in a way that also mitigates further changes so that we can limit the amount of damage that we're having to respond to.
What are the ways we all can do something about climate change, like as an individual or as a whole society?
This is really the key question from my point of view, is what can we do? When I talk about climate change as being, it's a systemic problem. It's driven by our economy, by the way that we live, by our politics. And so then it's a bit unfair to say that individuals have to change, because actually we all know that there's a very limited amount that we can do as individuals, and we're all trapped into certain behaviours by the system. So we talked earlier about sort of rural people with no bus service. Of course they're trapped in car use. And so then if I then say to them, oh, well, you shouldn't be driving, that's unfair. There's not much that they can do about that other than stay home, not go to work and not access services, right? So they pretty much have to drive. But what we can all do as individuals is make every decision that it is within our power to make in the most environmentally friendly way. So if you have access to public transport, use it. If you have a decision about whether you fly or take the train, or even not travel at all, then make that decision. Take the train, or if you really don't need to travel, don't travel. If you can, buy food that is more sustainably produced. Try not to buy the stuff that's in plastic packaging. Try not to buy processed food. All of these sort of micro decisions all add up to make a big difference in the world if we all do them. They also demonstrate that as a society, we're serious about this. We want things to change. And that pressure can lead companies and the government to change the way that they're behaving as well. So, for example, if there is enough demand for sustainably produced food, then companies are going to respond to that demand and meet that demand and produce the things that we want to buy. If governments are seeing that actually people aren't driving their cars, they're all taking public transport, then they can respond to that in the way that they make decisions on the kinds of infrastructure that they fund and support and the services that they provide to us. So as individuals, we have a lot of power in our micro decisions, in the way that we live our everyday life. But the biggest change will come from decision makers, from the companies, from the politicians that really create these infrastructures and create the opportunity spaces that we have for making changes. And so the best things that we can do are collective actions. So that can be, for example, I often talk about the power of protest and demonstration. That can be as simple as taking to the streets on a Friday with the Fridays for Future movement and being present and showing that you also want change. And as we've seen across Europe, as those numbers grow and grow, it changes the political conversation that's being had. The Fridays for Future movement has achieved in a very short period of time what scientists have not achieved in the last 50 years. So it's a really powerful movement. So join these demonstrations. But also you can do more tangible things close to home. So join collective organisations that are doing small things for change. That might be, for example, joining an association around your school or village or community that's doing things for the community. And that might be having a voice on asking for trees to be planted to produce shade in your community. Or it might be, for example, pushing for a no-car area around a school so that people can walk to school safely and not be breathing in traffic fumes. And so these collective actions as well can unlock change for multiple individuals.
When it comes to consumption, we're quite often faced with an issue of greenwashing. That, okay, so we all want to buy more sustainable products, and quite often it's written, oh yes, it's very ecological, it's very green, and it's packaged nicely, and there are trees on the picture. But when the person looks a little bit deeper in it, it's like, maybe it's not that sustainable as it seems. So what can we do about this?
Don't buy stuff. Okay. There's certain things that we have to buy to maintain a good quality of life. We have to buy food, we have to buy energy, we have to move around, we have to look after our health. There are other things that we absolutely, fundamentally do not need. The amount of clothing that gets bought in Europe at the moment, for example, is just unnecessary. Nobody needs that much clothing. We don't need to change what we're wearing every few months to fit in with trends that are changing all the time. If you are buying that volume of clothing, you can make that choice if you buy the sort of the cheap throwaway, it's going to wear out clothing, or if you buy the sustainable option. Or you can make the choice just not to buy it at all. If you buy the cheap throwaway thing, that's probably the least sustainable thing you can do. But for many people is the only thing they can do, particularly people on low incomes. That's the least sustainable thing you can do. Or you could buy the thing that's labelled sustainable, and that might be marginally better. But you have to remember that there are still resources in that thing. It's required energy, land, people to make that piece of clothing that you're buying. If you don't need it, don't buy it. and you have saved that energy, you've saved those resources, you've saved that person power, just don't buy it. So I think what we can do, I think the first question that I always ask myself, and I really do have deliberations before buying anything, is to think, okay, do I need it at all? And if I really do need it, then what's the best, with the money that I have available, what's the best decision that I can make? And honestly, about 80% of the time, you end up not buying it because you think, well, actually, no, I really don't need another pair of shoes, or I really don't need another dress. I have enough stuff here. And if I really do need it, how can I do this more sustainably? And for me, that's often, okay, can I buy this secondhand? And then if I can't, how do I buy this in the most sustainable way? What's the most sustainable product?
I guess after all, it's all about being a little bit more mindful about your consumption patterns.
Absolutely. Being more mindful. And I think right at the beginning, we talked about the economic system and how that drives us into consuming, and consumption has emissions, it has an environmental impact.
Could you recommend any sources where we can find more information on our actions on climate change?
Mm-hmm. I think one good thing as an individual would be to have a look online for a carbon footprint calculator. And that can be quite a good way of looking, okay, if I take this holiday to this place, what's my carbon footprint here? And it can give you a good idea of where you can make big savings or where you can make small regular savings in the amount of emissions that you're responsible for. And you can see also, for example, you can think, oh, but if I drive here and do this thing and then drive back, that's actually quite small because it's just me. But it also gives you an idea of the amount of carbon that's already embedded in that product that you're buying because of the movement of materials to get there. So that a carbon footprint calculator can be a really useful tool as an individual. The other thing that could be quite useful would be the recent film called Don't Look Up. The directors of that film have launched a website on what you can do to combat the climate crisis. And they've worked with a big range of social scientists on that website. And so you can look up individual actions that you can do personally, but you can also look at the kinds of collective actions that you can join in with to try and push for change, to combat climate change.
When we're talking about contribution to climate change, is it true that every state contributes in the same way, or is it different?
When we look at what traditionally have been called developed countries, so those in industrialized economies, most of Europe, North America, we're responsible for far greater emissions than those countries in the global south or poorer countries. When we talk about the emissions that we're responsible for, we have to remember that it's not just the emissions at this moment in time, because our carbon emissions, our methane emissions sit in the atmosphere. They don't go anywhere. Once they're emitted, if they're not pulled into trees or into the ocean or other carbon sinks, then they accumulate and they build up over time. So the emissions that we're responsible for are not just those that we release today, they're those that have been released through time. So all of the industry, coal mining, for example, the energy that we use in this economy all through history is what we are responsible for as a country, as a bloc within Europe, as a society. We then compare that to, for example, those countries that are already suffering the catastrophic impacts of climate change. For example, India, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, where, okay, we might say that emissions from India today are quite high, but traditionally, through history, they're actually really low. So if we look at the cumulative emissions to a country like India, it's actually really low, and they're not responsible for climate change in the way that we are here in Europe. So that's really different. We also then need to look at where the consumption that's driving today's emissions is coming from? Who's pushing that? We live in a globalized economy. A phrase that quite often frustrates me when we're talking about climate change politics, for example, is people will often look to China and say, oh, but China's opening this and this power plant and producing all of these things and driving carbon emissions. And yes, the economic expansion in China and the expansion of its coal-fired power stations has been massive in recent years. But we also need to look at where it's producing goods for, who's consuming those goods. And actually, that's quite often us here in Europe or in North America that are driving these consumption patterns. We want to consume, we're buying goods and services, and it just so happens that these countries are producing them and meeting those demands. So it's just not good enough for us here in Europe to say, oh, well, we're doing all we can, yet we continue producing and consuming, and then blaming the country that's meeting our consumption demands for producing those carbon emissions. And so we need to look at our own direct carbon emissions from Europe, but also those emissions that we're responsible for by consuming goods and services and asking other people to provide those for us. And then you can see that actually our responsibility here in Europe is far greater than the responsibility of those countries that are suffering most from climate change at the moment. And that's why when we look at the working group to the IPCC report that came out 2 weeks ago, authors on that report have said that it is fundamentally a report about justice, because those people causing the emissions are not those people that are currently suffering. Those people that have not done really anything to cause emissions are those people that are suffering the most. And that's a question of justice.
When you look at the emission of a country in total, let's say, for example, Germany and China have similar emissions, but then you should also consider per capita emissions. So, and there comes quite a big difference.
Absolutely, there really does. And I think that when you look, for example, at a country the size of China, yeah, the per capita emissions are very low. And the vast majority of people in China, for example, living in rural areas or living in poverty themselves, it's just madness to suggest that they have any responsibility over climate change, really. They're just doing what they can do to survive. And to then hear sort of Europe say, oh, well, why should we be doing anything? It's the emissions are being produced here. That bothers me quite a lot.
And when we're talking about climate change, quite often also the topic of biodiversity is brought up.
So the two problems of climate change and biodiversity loss are very strongly linked. What we do know is that climate change drives biodiversity loss. So as temperatures rise, then species have to migrate or they die out. And so we can see, for example, just this week, we've been told that the Amazon rainforest is at a tipping point. If we don't take action very soon to properly protect the Amazon rainforest, it will not be a rainforest very soon. It will just die out and become tundra, like grasslands, a more desertified system. And that has a huge impact on biodiversity. I mean, that is one of the world's global hotspots of biodiversity. And if it doesn't exist, we lose countless species of plants and animals. Things we don't even know exist yet will be gone, which is quite devastating news, really. Quite a shock. And it's driven, of course, it's driven by deforestation and destruction within the Amazon. But it's also about this change in temperatures in climate that make it a viable ecosystem. We can see, again, the same IPCC report has really spelled out that this is happening and faster than we thought that it was ever going to. It's now accelerated the impact of biodiversity loss. So there's a direct link there. We also know that there are lots of things that we can do as a society that are beneficial to both biodiversity and to climate. So, for example, planting green space, improving semi-natural vegetation in agricultural landscapes, for example, that's of benefit to both biodiversity and to climate, because it can help with sequestering carbon, so mitigating climate change, and it can help us to adapt to climate change, for example, by producing cooling effects of shade and keeping water in the landscape. So in that way, they're linked. But to me, they're also fundamentally linked in that if you zoom out, these climate change and biodiversity loss are essentially symptoms of the same problem of overconsumption, of the way that we live as a society. When I was talking about consumption being at the heart of climate change, our consumption patterns and the way that we want more and more things, that's also at the heart of what's driving biodiversity loss. It's shifted our relationship with nature. So nature has become expendable because we want goods and services. And so we're chopping down trees, we're intensifying our agricultural production and losing biodiversity because we want to eat in a certain way, because we want certain materials, and we want to produce those on the land that we have available. Same processes that drive climate change are driving biodiversity loss. And to me, it doesn't make sense to really see them as separate problems. They're both impacts of this same problem. And that is fundamentally about our relationship as a society with nature and the way that we exploit and consume it.
When we're talking about different states and things they're doing for climate change, do you have any examples of states which were really good on being more sustainable recently?
I think there are different countries that do different things well. But I think that we have to keep in mind that I don't think there is an example of a country that is sustainable in all areas. When we talk in Europe about sustainability, I think there's a tendency to look to, for example, the Nordic states, so Norway and Sweden, for example, as being really sustainable and doing things well, particularly Norway with sort of electric car subsidies, lots of forestry happening there, and the sort of idea that they don't have much industry left within Norway itself, and so it's doing lots of sustainable things. But I think that that's a really questionable narrative, because actually a country like Norway has a lot of fossil fuel wealth. And so we have to ask, again, if we're talking about historical emissions, well, how is it that Norway is a rich country right now that can afford to give subsidies for things like electric cars? And that's because of its oil wealth and the way that it's extracting oil and releasing emissions beyond its own borders. And so when we talk about countries that are sustainable, we can look at what it's doing within its own borders as a country, but that's quite often greenwashing if you don't look at the impacts that are happening beyond its borders. And that can be through things like the industries that it has outside of Norway, for example, but it can also be about the emissions that are embedded in the things that people in that country are buying and consuming, and the way that it's living. I think that we also have to question some of the measures that people are taking to be sustainable. So, for example, if we're talking about Europe and this emphasis on electromobility, that there's a lot of conversations about this around the idea that, okay, we all need to shift from traditional fossil-fueled cars to electric cars in order to be sustainable. And I really would question that idea that actually shifting to electromobility is sustainable. Yes, we can say that there are lower carbon dioxide emissions associated with that. But where are we getting the materials for these batteries, for example? And we're mining them. And where are we mining them? We're mining them in the global south predominantly. And that has deforestation impacts, it has social impacts, and it has pollution impacts from the chemicals that we use to extract these materials. And getting into the waterways and getting into the ecosystems, and it has health impacts on the people living there. So countries that currently have a narrative that they're more sustainable, that they've shifted away from sort of environmentally unsustainable actions, generally tend to be those that are closing their eyes to the impacts that they're having beyond their borders. So I don't think that there are currently sustainable countries at all. And until we think about this in a globalized way and start matching the global impacts to where the demand is and to the behaviours that are driving those global impacts, then we're not going to solve climate change. It's a global problem. We need to think joined up about this.
I guess everybody has to accept the responsibility for their own actions and don't close their eyes on the things that's happening. When you look at the emission of a country in total, let's say, for example, Germany and China have similar emissions, but then you should also consider per capita emissions. And there comes quite a big difference.
Absolutely, there really does. And I think that when you look, for example, at a country the size of China, the per capita emissions are very low. And the vast majority of people in China, for example, living in rural areas or living in poverty themselves, it's just madness to suggest that they have any responsibility over climate change, really. They're just doing what they can do to survive. And to then hear sort of Europe say, oh, well, why should we be doing anything? It's the emissions are being produced here. That bothers me quite a lot.
And when we're talking about climate change, quite often also the topic of biodiversity is brought up.
So the two problems of climate change and biodiversity loss are very strongly linked. What we do know is that climate change drives biodiversity loss. So as temperatures rise, then species have to migrate or they die out. And so we can see, for example, just this week, we've been told that the Amazon rainforest is at a tipping point. If we don't take action very soon to properly protect the Amazon rainforest, it will not be a rainforest very soon. It will just die out and become tundra, like grasslands, a more desertified system. And that has a huge impact on biodiversity. I mean, that is one of the world's global hotspots of biodiversity. And if it doesn't exist, we lose countless species of plants and animals. Things we don't even know exist yet will be gone, which is quite devastating news, really. Quite a shock. And it's driven, of course, it's driven by deforestation and destruction within the Amazon. But it's also about this change in temperatures and climate that make it a viable ecosystem. We can see, again, the same IPCC report has really spelled out that this is happening and faster than we thought that it was ever going to. It's now accelerated the impact of biodiversity loss. So there's a direct link there. We also know that there are lots of things that we can do as a society that are beneficial to both biodiversity and to climate. So, for example, planting green space, improving semi-natural vegetation in agricultural landscapes, for example, that's of benefit to both biodiversity and to climate, because it can help with sequestering carbon, so mitigating climate change, and it can help us to adapt to climate change, for example, by producing cooling effects of shade and keeping water in the landscape. So in that way, they're linked. But to me, they're also fundamentally linked in that if you zoom out, these climate change and biodiversity loss are essentially symptoms of the same problem of overconsumption, of the way that we live as a society. When I was talking about consumption being at the heart of climate change, our consumption patterns and the way that we want more and more things, that's also at the heart of what's driving biodiversity loss. It's shifted our relationship with nature. So nature has become expendable because we want goods and services. And so we're chopping down trees, we're intensifying our agricultural production and losing biodiversity because we want to eat in a certain way because we want certain materials, and we want to produce those on the land that we have available. Same processes that drive climate change are driving biodiversity loss. And to me, it doesn't make sense to really see them as separate problems. They're both impacts of this same problem. And that is fundamentally about our relationship as a society with nature and the way that we exploit and consume it.
When we're talking about different states and things they're doing for climate change, do you have any examples of states which were really good on being more sustainable recently?
I think there are different countries that do different things well. But I think that we have to keep in mind that I don't think there is an example of a country that is sustainable in all areas. When we talk in Europe about sustainability, I think there's a tendency to look to, for example, the Nordic states, so Norway and Sweden, for example, as being really sustainable and doing things well, particularly Norway with sort of electric car subsidies, lots of forestry happening there, and the sort of idea that they don't have much industry left within Norway itself, and so it's doing lots of sustainable things. But I think that that's a really questionable narrative, because actually a country like Norway has a lot of fossil fuel wealth. And so we have to ask, again, if we're talking about historical emissions, well, how is it that Norway is a rich country right now that can afford to give subsidies for things like electric cars? And that's because of its oil wealth and the way that it's extracting oil and releasing emissions beyond its own borders. And so when we talk about countries that are sustainable, we can look at what it's doing within its own borders as a country, but that's quite often greenwashing if you don't look at the impacts that are happening beyond its borders. And that can be through things like the industries that it has outside of Norway, for example, but it can also be about the emissions that are embedded in the things that people in that country are buying and consuming, and the way that it's living. I think that we also have to question some of the measures that people are taking to be sustainable. So, for example, if we're talking about Europe and this emphasis on electromobility, that there's a lot of conversations about this around the idea that, okay, we all need to shift from traditional fossil-fueled cars to electric cars in order to be sustainable. And I really would question that idea that actually shifting to electromobility is sustainable. Yes, we can say that there are lower carbon dioxide emissions associated with that. But where are we getting the materials for these batteries, for example? And we're mining them. And where are we mining them? We're mining them in the global south predominantly. And that has deforestation impacts, it has social impacts, and it has pollution impacts from the chemicals that we use to extract these materials and getting into the waterways and getting into the ecosystems, and it has health impacts on the people living there. So countries that currently have a narrative that they're more sustainable, that they've shifted away from sort of environmentally unsustainable actions, generally tend to be those that are closing their eyes to the impacts that they're having beyond their borders. So I don't think that there are currently sustainable countries at all. And until we think about this in a globalized way and start matching the global impacts to where the demand is and to the behaviours that are driving those global impacts, then we're not going to solve climate change. It's a global problem. We need to think joined up about this.
I guess everybody has to accept the responsibility for their own actions and don't close their eyes on the things that's happening. When you were trying to have a more sustainable life, have you experienced any difficulties while you're doing this?
Oh, yes. And I would say also huge privileges in doing so. So let's start with the difficulties. obviously I'm not Czech, so I live in a country that is not my home country, and my family, a lot of my family is still back in the UK. In order to keep in contact with them, I do face difficult decisions about how do I do that. There is no travel option that doesn't have emissions. And how do I get there? Do I spend a lot of money and a lot of days taking the train to go and see them? Because, of course, they don't even live in London, so it's not that it's not that straightforward. Which, when you have a partner and 2 children and taking the train, that's really expensive and very time consuming. Do I take the cheaper option of flying, meaning that I can actually keep in touch with them and we can afford it? So that's probably the biggest difficulty in my life, is the travel. Yeah. And I never have perfectly resolved it. Other than the fact that when you live through a global pandemic, you don't get to travel to see them anyway. And I also recognise that I have huge privilege in the kinds of decisions that I can make. For example, I don't ever buy my children clothes, but that's because I have friends and family who have older children, and they just pass them all on to me. If you don't have that kind of network, then you end up buying clothes. You have no other choice. I also was fortunate enough to be able to afford to put my kids through cloth diapers. So I didn't use disposable diapers, I used cloth diapers on them. And that's it costs quite a lot of money. I think overall it worked out cheaper than buying disposable diapers for 2 children, but it's an initial cost that you pay up front, and not everybody can do that.
I guess it gets quite a big time investment.
Yeah.
So it's not something you just throw away. You have to take care of it. You have to wash it. You have
Yeah.
to make sure that there is enough for the next following days. And
yes. And I was very relieved when they both came out of diapers. That was a celebration. So there are difficulties associated with the decisions that we make, and I fully understand why people don't make the same decisions that I've made. And I think that one of the things that we have to be very careful to do in society is to recognise that currently the things we label as sustainable consumption are more expensive, and they are not accessible to everybody. And this is why I spend quite a lot of time emphasising the collective and the system changes, more than I spend time emphasising the individual changes. Because when we just focus on individuals and we just put in place policies and say, okay, well, if you want change, then you have to change, we're denying the fact that that change is not available to everybody, that actually it is more expensive. Not everybody has the luxury of making these decisions.
And then we have disposable straws problem. I think that's a really good example for this.
Yeah, it bothers me that we're getting to the point of blaming people for not taking sustainable actions, when actually a lot of people are just doing what they can with the resources that they have available. And if we are following, we talked about this sort of technocentric pathway, where we're saying, okay, people aren't going to be allowed, we're going to say that people should be driving electric cars, and that's the sustainable thing to do. But they're more expensive and not everybody has access to that. We're starting to stigmatise those people who do not have the luxury of making the sustainable decision, which isn't very sustainable in itself anyway. And that's a situation that I'm very keen to avoid.
And recently there have been more talks about this new disease for younger generation, which is called environmental guilt or climate guilt, that people feel really bad about not making certain choices just because the lifestyle doesn't afford it, or they don't have enough money or time. So I guess.
Yeah, and I think these are critical questions that we need to be asking as a society. And they're critical questions that we just don't have a forum or a place to have this discussion. When do we have it, right? It just doesn't exist, this conversation space, and we need to have it, because we do need to be thinking very carefully about the fact that we have a generation of kids growing up scared about what's coming. And I wish I could tell them that they don't need to be scared, but I can't tell them that. The science tells us that actually now is the time to be scared. Change is coming and it's not good. And the report 2 weeks ago, the IPCC report, spelled out that there is an opportunity, there is a window of opportunity here, but it is closing quickly. So we have to do something now. Hope is not lost, but we are going to lose it if we don't act now. So I can't tell them not to be scared. Of course, they need to be scared. Or it's logical to me that they're worried about this. We also have people who are feeling huge guilt about this, about the decisions that they're making and the things that they're not able to do. And then we also have people who have sufficient wealth, they're comfortable, they're living well, and they want to do something, but they don't know what to do or how to do it. And then we have people who are actually doing very well off climate change and stand to gain from climate change, or they are representing business interests who don't want change because it would change their profit margins or perhaps challenge their ability to accumulate more wealth. And I think that as a society, that's we need to be talking about this and thinking about what's the equitable way forward, rather than just letting it be and say, okay, we'll just keep coming up with a techno fix to solve this and this symptom. Let's really reevaluate this, what we're doing, what justice means to our future generations and to our neighbours around the world.
And when we're talking about personal and family life, are you trying to promote this kind of information or views on other people? Are you talking about this in your free time?
Yeah, and fun at parties. Yes and no. Yes, I talk about it. And I think that this is also something that we can all do. I think that there's a general feeling in society that no one else is panicking. It's obviously nothing to worry about. And that's also dangerous because it's happening, and I think people don't realise that it's happening, or they're reassured that, well, the politicians aren't panicking, they say it's going to be fine, it must be fine. And they're not really aware of the fact that it's happening. And so I think it's quite important that those of us who do have information on this do talk to people and share that with their friends and family. And I do. I think we also do, though, have to be very careful not to fall into the gap of being seen to blame people. I think logically, a lot of people's response when you bring it up is, oh, but I mean, I have to drive, or I'm not giving up my foreign holiday. And I think that we need to find ways to have these conversations in ways that aren't confrontational and that don't blame people for the decisions that they are taking, but that engage in raising awareness and raising understanding about what's happening and the fact that we do need things to change and what can we do about that. So I think having these conversations is important. Yeah, it would be good to see it being picked up more by media, by mainstream media. I think there's been some interesting films released recently, for example, Don't Look Up, that did spark a global conversation. All of this is being produced in English. There's films on it in English. There's reports being produced in English, and that's not accessible. And it feels like it's not talking about the society and the culture that we have here. And so it doesn't feel like it's about us, really. And I think that needs to change. The more that we can have conversations about what it means here for us and how we are going to address that, I think that's a very important thing we should be doing.
Okay, thank you very much.